Hey everybody, Andrew Hartman here again, back here with Decathlon today. And before we get started, I just wanted to talk about a few things here. First off, make sure you follow us on Twitter at Academic Decathlon. Make sure you watch the video on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, all that typical mumbo jumbo. Go to the Decathlon website, as you can see here, where we also have a blog that we're posting on, talking about some of the kind of going ons in the decathlon community. And then lastly, find us on Demodeck Talk, where both me and Nick Sinitis are in there and communicating and collaborating with everybody. And, we just, again, really want to build this community. That's kind of a huge goal of ours. So we would love to have your input on what we're doing. So today, what I wanted to talk about with the school year getting ready is what you actually do to remember this stuff. There's 700 pages worth of material, and you have to have it all memorized as well as you can in one day, right? You take one day of all the tests for most cases, right? I think at nationals you take art a little earlier, uh, and maybe some other places, but for the most part you're taking 7 tests in one day, and so your goal is to have everything memorized at the highest level at that one time. Now, as a program at Dulles, we haven't necessarily done that perfectly. There's been some times where, we've been super high up on a subject at regionals or even round one, and then by the time we got to state, it was not as high as it needed to be because we kind of thought, oh, well, we're good on this. We don't need to focus on this, which is, a really bad way to do it, I think. And so this year especially, we're really going to be hitting on a lot of ideas about how to make sure that they're retaining information as we go, rather than just having to reread things over the course of the year. They're still going to have to do that, obviously, right? I mean, if you're at that higher levels of competing, the amount of times you read science is anywhere between probably 3 to 5 times, depending on what kind of reader you are. Uh, and I mean that in a more in an active reading role, at least trying to be active, which is something we'll get into today. But so, what can we do as coaches, and what can you do as students to make sure you're actively reading and actively getting the information you need? Well, as coaches, you don't have as much control as the students do. As students, you guys have tons of control over your ability to actually go out and learn this material. It's really up to how much you want to be successful. But that's only half the issue, because another half of the issue is a lot of students don't know how to study properly. They, as a former student and decathlete myself, I had 2 years competing. In the first year, I worked my butt off, and I was not that good. I was studying, I was reading, I thought I was acing all these tests and quizzes and stuff. I was, getting quizzes and going through them with the resources and checking them and feeling good about it. Specifically, I remember this time at state my junior year where, coming out of the social science test, I was telling my teammates, just like, I made a 900. I aced it. Give me that medal. That was a 660. So, I really thought I had a grip on how to learn. It was pretty clear I didn't at that time. And so, as senior year came around, we kind of figured out a lot of things to do individually that worked out really well for our team as a whole. And, we went from 40,000 and top 15, I think, at state, to 50,000 in first place with 8 juniors my junior year, and then we all kind of moved up together. So I kind of want to approach it from both sides. I want to approach it from both the student side. I want to approach it from the coach's side of how to get the best out of your time. And one of the major things I want to bring up with this is something that's called recall memory and active learning. Uh, so when people tend to read, they tend to read fairly passively, right? Which is one of the reasons that one of my biggest things is note taking. Which I still, when I still teach my students, hey, take notes, I still think they're doing it wrong because they're going through emotion rather than actually engaging with what note taking is. And I'll come back to that for a second, or in a little bit later. But what I want to talk about right now is kind of what coaches can do, and that is creating a place where people can have spaced repetition and where people can have active recall. And I kind of want to get into the original theories about this first, and then jump into kind of how it could be implemented in the classroom. So, going back into the history of how people kind of thought this out, and I'm not going to go super in detail, I'm really going to kind of just talk about the beginning of it. We need to talk about this guy, Hermann Ebbinghaus. Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist, according to Wikipedia. But what he did is he had this experiment where he created a bunch of three-syllable nonsensical words, and he tried to memorize them over time. And he figured out that you know, uh, as he tried to memorize them, the further away he got from actively trying to learn them, the less he learned them better. Right? He created some sort of formula, which I'm not going to really get into. But basically, he kind of came up with the idea of the timeline of how we lose memory, right? How we lose facts and ideas that we had learned, right? Not necessarily memory in terms of like your personal memories, right? Things you've done and whatnot, but rather the things that you're trying to actively learn. And so that kind of led to a lot of different research and stuff, which I'm not super well versed in, but as a teacher, what really interests me most is the forgetting curve. And the forgetting curve is this idea that if you only read it once, right, or if you only memorize a certain list of facts once, which hey, what's Decathlon, right? That's pretty much what it is. If you only memorize it once, right, by the time you get a week out, 6 days out, it's all pretty much gone. Okay, but if you read it once and then you read it twice, you read it again right here on the second day, even though this is day one, right? If you read it again on the second day, then your forgetting curve is a lot better, right? It's a lot more forgiving, and so as you move down that curve, you're still going to forget some stuff over time, but you're going to forget less if you read it a second time or are actively engaged by the material a second time. And same goes for a third time and a fourth time. And as you can see here by this fourth time, according to this curve, I'm not saying this is scientific, but more of just an idea, you're really locked in on that information, right? Really, really locked in on that information. And so that leads into a concept called active recall. And active recall is the process of engaging with a material progressively, right? Or actively, I should say, as it says here, right? Where you are, instead of just simply reading a piece of material, which you do need to do, right? You have to read it to start, but you have to be asking yourself questions, right? And the thing that the Wikipedia page here likes to bring up a lot is flashcards. I'm not a big fan of flashcards. I think they're a little elementary, but the idea behind flashcards is really good. And I think I'm actually coming around on the idea of flashcards, especially the mobility of it, right? You can kind of just have them out wherever. But so the way we do active recall in class, and we've talked about this in previous videos, is the quizzes, right? It's the focus quizzing every day. Now, the problem with that becomes the incentive structure for a lot of them ends up being, okay, well, I really want to do well on this quiz, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cram right before the quiz, and I'm going to regurgitate that information into this quiz, and then it's gone, right? We're going to try some things to prevent that this year, but I can't control where they are periods 1, 2, 3, and 4 before they come to us, right? I can't control what they're allowed to do in those classes. I can't control what they do in the morning. My personal hope would be that they read all the night before, they review a little bit the day of, and then they take the quiz, and then that's one day of active recall, right? That already makes their memory better than if they just read. Okay, so that's active recall. That's an important part, and that's kind of one of the bedrocks of what we've done for years now. But the thing we haven't done, and the thing I'm really pushing for this year with our students, is the idea of spaced repetition. And so spaced repetition is simply this idea that even after this first day of active recall, we return back to that material, right? We return back to those things and try to see what we remembered. And so the way we're going to try to do that this year is through short answer questions that the kids hopefully will create themselves. It's kind of the hope. It's a lot to ask in a short amount of time. We start with an hour and a half, fifth period plus lunch. I think we're expanding to 2 hours in September. So at the very beginning of the year, this might be a little tough. But I really want to start it because if we added in later, it's not a norm, right? You want to create classroom norms, and so I would like to start with this really quickly. So basically, though, it's just like short answer questions where it's like quick hits of different sections, right? You know, if there's a section on Kennedy's home policies, right? You know, domestic policies. Well, then, you know, I can have the short answer question on that. That's open ended. They try to remember all they can. They kind of discuss it with their group and then see what they missed. And then, you know, maybe there's 2 or 3 questions on that per reading, and then we move on. And then at the end of the week, what we're going to do is give them an attempt to write the ability to write an essay about that material, right? So, you know, Monday reading, and then for the Monday reading, they have a Tuesday quiz, and then on Wednesday they have short answer questions that they'll read, and then Thursday we won't do anything with it, and then Friday they'll have an essay, right? Now that essay is going to hopefully combine a bunch of the stuff from the week. We're still kind of figuring out how that's going to work. It's going to require me to actually read the material a little more, which I know I've said I don't really like, but in this case, I think if I can provide them with more resources, I think it's a good thing. So yeah, spaced repetition I think is super duper important. The more you can get that spaced repetition in, the better it's going to be. Now, what does that spaced repetition look like for that stuff after 2 weeks, after a month? I'm still not sure. I this actually makes me, this makes me think that maybe when you look at Granada Hills Charter, right, a great program, but they take forever to get the resources, right? They, by the time they're at the round 1 meet, the other teams have done everything and they're doing amazing on everything. Where Granada Hills has done maybe 3 or 4 different subjects, but like those amazing teams are getting absolutely destroyed by Granada Hills in those 3 or 4 subjects. And it's pretty clear that once Granada Hills gets to all of the subjects, that it's game over. And I think maybe this is something that has to do with it, right? This idea of spaced repetition, where like they are maybe just isolating this one subject so into so much detail and spaced retrieval and active recall that by the time they get out of it, it's just there forever, right? And it's super well known. Not to say they don't go back to it. I'm sure they do, but maybe that's part of what they do. So active recall and spaced repetition are super important things for us to do. Another way we can do spaced repetition with the active recall is that when we talk about our quizzes, we don't actually use all the questions on the quiz because we think that's a little overkill, especially because, the DIMNET quizzes are great, but they're written by students. And so sometimes some of those questions are not of the highest caliber, which I can understand. They're hard to write, don't get me wrong. But what we tend to do is usually do about half of them on a given quiz, right? We do odds or evens, and even this year maybe it might be even less than that. So then what we can do is pull out the other half later and ask them to quiz on that, right? So anyways, that's kind of the 2 big things about spaced repetition and active learning that we can do in the classroom. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today is student-based, student-centered. A lot of things that I want to talk about that I really try to, drill into my students, not only in Decathlon but in AP World History, and something that I found productive. And I'm not saying it's the best way, but I am saying that I was a bad student, and then I started learning this way, and then I became a good student, or at least what I consider to be a good student. And that is note taking. And most people, I would say, do not understand what note taking is fundamentally about. A lot of people take notes with the idea that they're using those notes for review. And while notes for review can be useful, notes for review are mostly pointless, because it is passive learning, as we kind of talked about earlier, right? You don't want to be a passive learner. You want to be an active learner. And note taking should make you an active learner, but what I hear a lot from my students and what I hear a lot from my decathletes is I just end up focusing on taking the notes, and I don't actually remember what I read, which is mind-boggling a little bit, because if you're writing it down, that should at least help you remember it a little more. And so what I was like that too, right? When I took notes originally, I would just take notes blindly, and so what people don't realize is like there's weird physicality to notes. There's an actual like physical way that you have to manipulate the way you take your notes. And the way that you are actively looking at one thing or the other. It is not just I have the resources next to me, I have my notebook next to me, I'm taking notes. It is read a thing, right? I tend to prefer paragraphs, especially with USAT, because I do feel like USAT's paragraphs are usually pretty digestible. And you know what I tend to tell students both in AP World, especially in AP World, but also in Decathlon, is that uh, they're paragraphs for a reason, right? They're not just paragraphs because we need to make a cut here. Usually, a paragraph has an idea that they're trying to get to you. And so, what I used to do, and what I still do when I was working, when I had to kind of relearn World History AP when we got a new textbook a few years ago, was you read a paragraph, you actively think about it, right? You read it, you look away, right? You physically eyeballs need to disengage from the text. You think about what you just read, and then you write everything down that you can recall, right? Without looking at the book. It's a three-step process, because what a lot of times happens is for a lot of students, it's not a three-step process of going from the book to your head to back to your notes. It is from the book to the notes, right? It is usually a two-step process, and that's not, you're not learning anything. You're just doing busy work, right? And a lot of my students in AP World History got frustrated because they thought that all they were doing was taking notes because I told them to take notes, and I was, I had to sit down with a bunch of them and be like, that's really inefficient. That's not what you should be doing. With Decathlon, it's a little more intense because the small facts are so important, right? In AP World History, I'm not nearly as concerned with the small facts. There are some things I want them to learn. For example, if we're going to talk about the Song Dynasty and we're going to talk about the politics of the Song Dynasty, I kind of need you to know the main political ideas. And for a lot of students as sophomores, that's something that they consider to be a detail, not something that's actually important. What I don't care about in AP World History is like the exact date of the Sui dynasty's beginning, or the exact date of Genghis Khan's takeover of China. I don't really care about those things. What I do care about is these larger ideas about political and social shifts and changes and things like that. With the Decathlon, it's a little bit different because those numbers do matter. Those tiny little details do really make a big difference. Now, when I get my decathletes to try to read over the summer, I really don't want them reading for those numbers. I really don't want them reading for those tiny little facts. I want them to kind of just get a big picture idea of what's going on. Like summarize each paragraph in a sentence or something. I don't want them to go crazy, which turns out that's what they were doing. I had a bunch of kids I saw this weekend who were like, yeah, I ended up ditching my notes for the summer, even though I read, because I realized I was taking way too detailed in the notes, right? And the reason that's hard in the summer is because there's no active recall in the back of it, right? There's no quizzing on the back end of it right now, so it's tough for them to really learn that way. But with Decathlon, you have to be actively engaged with every fact that you can. I personally am a big believer that there is no big picture with Decathlon. A lot of people talk about having big picture ideas with Decathlon, making sure the big picture is captured first. Which I just said that, right? And yeah, there are some big ideas that you can get, but what I wanted them to do over the summer was just get a feel for the resource, so they're not going in completely blind. But when we start reading in class, I want them to know every single little detail possible, because when USAD does ask for those larger concept questions, they are asking larger concept questions about the tiny details. And if you are smart enough to be able to piece all those tiny details together, and hopefully we can help them along as coaches, then those are super easy, right? A lot of times those are the ones where you kind of have to narrow out two or three choices and then be like, okay, it's either this or this, based on the wording of it. And then if you've read it enough and you understand it enough, then you've nailed it, right? You're going to get it no problem. Whereas most of the questions on USAT stuff is not like that. Most of the questions, depending on the test writer, but most of the questions are like very, very detailed, especially on those really hard tests. There's always those hard tests every year where people come out and be like, oh my gosh, it was so difficult. But a lot of times when those come about, we end up really, really breaking out of that, out of a pack with people, because we know the details, right? That's our thing. I'm a firm believer in the details. The details create the bigger picture, not the big picture allows you to learn the details better. So it is a rigorous process with Decathlon to take notes that I think are efficient. I was a varsity, so I didn't do other homework, but when I was in high school, it took me, anywhere from 3 to 4 hours to do each night's reading, and that was about what we're doing on the schedule, right? And you know, I was very successful because of that. I thought it was really great, and I learned a lot from it. And it made college a joke. It made college incredibly easy. Uh, but I think that's hard to ask a lot of people to do to spend that much time a night. But I think if you really want to be one of the best decathletes in the country, I think that's what you have to do. You have to take that time out. You are not going to be one of the best decathletes simply by reading 30 minutes a night or even an hour a night. To be honest, it's not going to happen. You have to take the time, but you have to make that time worth it. You have to make that time valuable. And so a lot of that comes from my personal opinion from taking notes like that. There's very few students I've had that didn't have to take notes to be successful. Um, and those kids are incredibly intelligent. So uh, yeah, I just so that's my fundamental framework of what a good decathlete looks like, is a note taker, right? As a note taker, and then my favorite thing to do with my notes is, if I'm going to use them again, which usually I don't. Usually I just chunk them. Like, notes are not for review. I'll get to that in a second. But one of my favorite things to do is I would take my notes, and then those notes would be completely full, right? Because if I forgot something in the paragraph, I would go back and put it into my notes, right? And then I would take notes on my notes, right? So then I would have just this really distilled information, right? That I think the most important thing is, and things are, which is everything, but cutting out a lot of the fat and stuff. So when you take those notes, right? If you're done taking those notes, a lot of people think notes are for review, and that is, again, 100% wrong. Those notes are simply for the thought process, the brain process of writing, right? The kinesthetic idea of physically using your hand to write down stuff is a way better way to learn than highlighting, than typing on a computer. We are banning laptops from our team this year. They're not allowed to use laptops. They're going to carry those dang resources around with them. It's scientifically proven. Like, if you guys need research, I will bring it up in the next video. But it has been proven time and time again that note taking by hand is without a doubt the best way to learn stuff. And decathlon is the ultimate, memory challenge, right? And so the best, again, so to kind of wrap this all up, I guess, is to say, on the coach's side, active recall, spaced repetition, we can really help with that to make them better decathletes. On the student side, you have to take notes. You have to take active notes. Right? You can't take passive notes where you're just copying the resource into your notebook. You have to take active notes where it's going from the resource to your brain. You're actively thinking about what you just read, and then you're putting it on the notebook. So those are kind of the three big things I wanted to bring up today, kind of talking about just how to learn the material, right? How you learn it for the long haul. Um, and then you might be asking, well, what do you do on the second time you read through? What happens when you've gone through your first part of the schedule and you've read everything, all 6 resources, not including math already? What do you do next? Well, you do it again. You start all over. And so if I am doing this right, if I am thinking about how much we have thought about these resources, I've read it, that's 1. I've thought about it, that's 2. I have inscribed it on my notes, that's 3. And then the next day I'm quizzing on it, that's 4. And the next day after that we're taking another set of quizzes on it that are more open-ended, that's 5. And then at the end of the week, if we're writing an essay about it, that's 6. Right? So that's possibly 6 times within a week that we're recalling this memory. And hopefully that can get us through the 2 to 3 months that it'll take for us to start back at that point. Now, there will be times in there where we will review that stuff, right? We'll take time out, and maybe that's through the form of an essay, maybe that's the form of a test, maybe that's just the kids going out on their own to do it. I still haven't figured out how we're going to necessarily make sure, hey, 2 weeks later, after finishing music. Hey, let's go think about music again for a little bit. I'm not sure how that looks right now, but hopefully, right, those 6 times are enough to carry the memory to the next time we read it. And then also we have practice meets, right? So those practice meets are also helping them engage with the material again. So that's 7 because we have one in October. That's 8. We have one in November in Friendswood, and then pretty much right after the Friendswood one, we're resetting the whole schedule, right? So that's 8 times, hopefully, that we have thought about the material before we even started again, right? And one of our big failings again last year is we didn't do the restart. We tried the restart, and then I really kind of let them go on their own. And I think that while that can be effective, I think it wasn't as effective as it should have been because I was not there to really push a framework, and that allowed a lot of goofing around, which is fun. We had a lot of fun last year, like a lot of fun, up until the night state ended, right? When we're like, hey, guess what? We're second, you know. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to say on this one. Again, check out Zathlon, the Zathlon website, YouTube, Zathlon page, Twitter, Academic Zathlon. Find us on the Demodeck Talk message boards where we will be posting this. Again, we would love some discussion about all this. I know that there are smarter people than me who have different ways of taking notes. My personal opinion, though, is that people who it's kind of like star athletes being coaches, right? A star athlete's not gonna be a great coach because they were just naturally gifted, right? A lot of them were, right? Like a Michael Jordan's not gonna be a great coach because he's just like he worked hard. Don't get me wrong, but like he's also just naturally skilled, right? LeBron James, LeBron James might actually be a great coach. That's another thing. That dude's awesome, but there's a lot to be said for like really poor athletes being good, sports, athletes in their field, and then coming in and being really good coaches because they work their butts off, right? Jose Mourinho, right, the Manchester United coach, really comes to mind with that of like a dude who did not play professional soccer but really understands how it works. I was not a good student, and I'm not naturally gifted, right? I never got a 2400, or I guess a 1600 these days, right? Heck, I was under 2000 as a junior on my SAT, which for some people is really good. For some people is terrible, right? But I wasn't top of the list, and then I was able to figure out how it works, right, at a later age. And so smarter people who might just be like, I just read it and kept reading it, like that's awesome. I don't think that works for everybody. Uh, so anyways, sorry for this last minute rant here. Again, just to kind of summarize what we're saying, spaced repetition and active recall are super duper important in things you can do really well as a coach. And then active note taking is really important as a student. So again, comment, let me know what you guys think. I had a great time talking to you guys and making this video, and I will see y'all soon.